Hello and welcome to Axumawian Media. My name is Melat Habtu and I'll be hosting Inside Tigray, a show that will give you a Tigrayan perspective on global, continental, and statewide affairs. Please tune in, listen, engage, and participate for an insightful and constructive discussion. Hello, welcome everyone to Axumawian Media. We are on Inside Tigray today with a special guest, Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa. He has joined us today to speak about the many challenges and issues that we face currently in Ethiopia. And he's giving us some of his time today to share his perspective, his expertise in terms of the legal aspects of so many different factors right now that that challenge us in Ethiopia, we are very grateful to have him. So, Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa, as you all know, he's an Ethiopian, Melbourne-based legal scholar who specializes in constitutional, international, and legal theory. Welcome, Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa.
Thank you, Melat. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. So today it will be myself and Az who will be doing the discussion with Dr. Tsegaye. Just to begin, maybe let's start off with the organizations that you're a part of. I know we were just speaking about it, so just introduce the organization so people can have a perspective of your where you stand in terms of the type of movements and organizations that you are currently involved in.
Yes, I'm by profession, I'm a lawyer. Most of my adult life, I spent teaching law. But since I came to Melbourne here, and since the beginning of the Oromo protest movement in 2014, 2015, because I wrote one fateful article which says, "Why resist the master plan?" I became the de facto intellectual spokesperson of the Oromo protest movement, and many people started to see me as an activist, which I am not, but I would like to see myself as a public intellectual. And so since then, I was very much part of the public discussion in the area of constitutional law of Ethiopia, and particularly the issues related to federalism, self-determination, minority rights, human rights in general, and all the laws that govern the public life of Ethiopia. And mostly because I am an Oromo, by the way, and because I speak on Oromo issues, both friends and foes consider me as an Oromo activist. But so I took that as part of my identity. And I have been very active in the Oromo protest movement. I was one of the international network of network of intellectuals and students who organized on social media the Oromo protest movement when my friends Jawar and the rest were in outside of Ethiopia. And since that time on, we have been working on a number of organizing and mobilizing. And in the diaspora, we have been trying to create a common platform for all Oromo activists or activist organizations to coordinate our actions and to have a clear idea of strategic goals. And in that regard, in 2016, I was involved in the bringing together of what happened, what transpired as the Oromo Leaders Convention, which had its inaugural meeting conference in 2016 in Atlanta and completed its round of meetings in Washington, D.C. in 2017. That time we were already seeing the cracks within the government of the EPRDF and the prime minister about to resign, and he did resign eventually. And we realized that there is change coming, and change was inevitable. And we were trying to say, okay, if the change comes, how do we make the change work in our favor, in our people's favor? and how do we coordinate all the disparate movements outside Ethiopia and within Ethiopia, because the movement within Ethiopia wasn't political, it was a social movement. It's a young people, Kare and Kero, to try to resist some of the policy measures and articulating also the demand for social justice, broader social justice, constitutional rights, and so on and so forth. So in preparation for the eventual change after the protest, we were trying to put together a convention of all Oromo political parties, political leaders, civic society organizations, other institutions, and that was finally, that came together as the Oromo Leaders Convention. And I was at that time the person who drafted the Oromo Freedom Charter. And the Oromo Freedom Charter is simply the codification of Oromo political interests in the Ethiopian political terrain. What does the Oromo want? And if we know this clearly, all of us, if we understand exactly what the strategic goals and national aspirations of the Oromo are, then coordinating action and collective endeavor wouldn't be much difficult. Instead of talking about unifying organizations, it's better if we unify the vision and the strategic goals so that they can come together on those and collaborate on those strategic goals. So that was the first attempt. Strangely, that movement was overtaken by the change, and before that came to have legs and feet on the ground, the change arrived, and everybody ran to go home independently, and then we see what happens. In 2018, the change happened. 2019, the war on Oromia started immediately when the Oromo Liberation Army refused to disarm because Abiy failed to sign the Asmara Accord. In Asmara, the OLF and the Ethiopian government had reached some kind of agreement, they say, but it wasn't a written agreement. And before the agreement the accord was signed, the Oromo Liberation Front went to Ethiopia, and the army, part of it, was the one that was in Asmara, in Eritrea, was, they came through Mekele. And then when the leaders arrived in Addis Ababa, the government of Abiy Ahmed did not want to sign the accord. And so given that the accord wasn't a signed one, and we don't know exactly what assurances they have given each other, they didn't know what the terms of relationship were. The ones that were operating in Ethiopia, the Oromo Liberation Army, a fringe of them, that were operating within Ethiopia in a very guerrilla type engagement, those refused to put down their arms. And so at the start, there was an attempt to force the leadership, the political leadership of OLF, to kind of rein in on the breakaway group. Then in 2018, 2019, the leadership disowned them, literally abandoned them, and then started a negotiation, a kind of a mediation effort by Jawar Bekele and other political Oromo elders and so on. That didn't materialize. Then, of course, the government of Ethiopia said, I am going to do a law enforcement operation. I'm going to rout them out in 3 weeks. And the war started in earnest. And from that, following that, this was in April, in late June or early July, there was the assassination of the Oromo artist Hachalu Hundessa, who was basically the person who offered the soundtrack behind the Oromo protest movement. And he was assassinated, and all the Oromo political leaders have been jailed. Some of them are now released, but most of them still stay in prison. And in fact, most of the leaders of the Oromo Liberation Front, as we speak, are freed by courts. They are acquitted by court. The prosecution said, I have no cause against them. I have nothing, no charge against them. But the police has rearrested them, and they kept them in detention for no reason, for no legal reason. To date, all the leaders are in prison except Daud, which is the Secretary General of the Oromo Liberation Front. He himself has been in house arrest for a long time. So when that happened, we literally said, okay, the last attempt for Oromos to find their place in Ethiopia and to play a positive role to transform the empire into a more democratic and a fair and just society is gone for good. So now we need to recast the struggle, reorient it, reframe it. And then in that reframing process, we started to imagine, those of us who are outside, as alongside protesting the war, alongside protesting, demanding the release of the political prisoners, alongside demanding justice for Hachalu and those types of people who were assassinated and publicly executed and so on. Alongside those efforts, we also wanted to create once more a united front among all Oromo political factions, Oromo public intellectuals, Oromo activists, media institutions, civil society organizations, etc. And that was in the form of World Oromo Congress, which is basically a coalition of global Oromo community associations and civil organizations and so on and so forth. In that, I was also very much active, and one of the things we wanted to do was to have 5 major areas of intervention from outside. The global Oromo diaspora has to somehow support the struggle at home and make sure that the leaders are released and justice is achieved and the political space is broadened, and all those things. And as we tried to do that, what we could do from outside was to use knowledge generation and production of ideas that help galvanize the mass. So that was the intellectual component that was to be done through a think tank. And then there was the media effort, bringing kind of a media council so that they can also work in a network, in concert, to achieve those strategic goals we all aspire to achieve. And then thirdly, the humanitarian crisis, because there was state-created starvation, there was displacement, massive displacement, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to create a humanitarian, an organized humanitarian intervention. And for that, we needed a humanitarian organization. And that was when I, along with my friends, created what now has become JIRA, permanent humanitarian fund for Oromos. And then there were other things that we wanted to do through the World Oromo Congress. The World Oromo Congress also did not succeed as we wanted, but because JIRA was, although it was a global effort, it was a global enterprise, it was registered and established in Australia first. And that we couldn't take it back. It was already established and it had a membership. It took off. And as we speak, I am now the public secretary of JIRA, Permanent Humanitarian Fund for Oromos. So that's one of the things that I do. That's what JIRA stands for. And then the other thing I am part of is that because of my scholarship and also my work before I came to Australia, and in the process of this years of social activism, social political activism, I focus on multinational efforts in Ethiopia. I work on federalism, the idea of recognition, mutual recognition among the nations, and the possibility of redeeming the empire through a federal union in which you respect each other, you govern your locality by yourselves, and you co-govern the country fairly together by sharing political power, economic resources, and social opportunities, all of them. And because I am very much vocal in this area, it happened to be my responsibility to bring together a group of activists from all national groups to come together and work on the common interests of the oppressed nations of Ethiopia, the common interest being the interest, the aspiration to achieve self-determination, be it at the local level or at the national level, at the regional level and at the national level, which means that groups such as the Sidama, the Afar, the Agao, the Command, the Oromo, Tigray, especially since 2020 when the war was officially launched, because there was already a war since 2018, but and since 2020 we had all sorts of groups whose right was actually as coming under assault since the ascendance of Abiy Ahmed to power. In the name of reform, what was happening was pushback against the federal constitution, which is the embodiment of the principle of self-determination, and which also enacts the right to self-determination as a fundamental right of all nations. And so because of that, they said we have to come together and we have to make a concerted effort to push back against the unitarist onslaught, so to say, of Abiy and his crew. So in that context, we created first what is called Hibr Multinational Federalists Group, which is basically emphasizing on the diversity. Hibr means the diverse groups in diversity, literally, in Amharic. And then we realized that soon after the war on Tigray started in earnest, and we realized that the federation didn't matter to stand against the centralist urge on the part of the government in Ethiopia. And we, having realized that the states could not do anything to stop that kind of excesses from the federal government, the idea of maintaining and staying within the federation kind of fell out of favor, especially among those who are victimized in the name of Ethiopia. And what is the point of telling the Tigrayan elite that we are federalists, we fight for federalism, when they were basically under a genocidal war and nobody is doing anything to stop it? In fact, most of the regions were also sending their special forces to join the Ethiopian military and engage in this genocidal war. So we needed to change names. So instead of focusing on federalism now, federalism is something that you can create through a consensual process only if you survive. In order to survive, though, you need to first engage in the work of achieving self-determination. So we changed it and we said Solidarity of Nations is the name. So I now am the president of the executive committee of Solidarity of Nations of Ethiopia, which tries to work on collaborations on helping the nation's national political groups to collaborate on common fronts, and currently focusing on 4 major areas, namely achieving self-determination, working on transitional justice, generally justice and accountability for mass atrocities and human rights violations, and thirdly, for reconstruction and restoration of war-ravaged societies, including some of the people in the southern region, like the Konso, the Gedio, and the Sidama, the Walaita, and the Kamant Agao people, in addition to the Oromo and the Tigrayan nations. So reconstruction and restoration, and fourthly, generally working on transformation of relationships among the nations, transformation of relationship between state and society, and bringing the whole nation into a moment of shared reckoning of the evil that is haunting us, which is basically a way of, the way of doing politics militarily, the politics of armament, social militarization. This has to be stopped. In order to do that, we have to come together as a people, and come to a point of shared condemnation of evil that is attacking the nations, and renewing the relationships between state and society vertically, and among the nations horizontally. So these are the four major areas of activities that the Solidarity of Nations is engaged in, and that's one of the things that I do. Now that's a long way of introducing myself and some of the things that I do.
No, that was very much needed. I think we need to understand all the different works that you've been involved in and are currently you've taken on board, because I mean that kind of ties into a lot of the questions we want to ask you. So I mean, you kind of mentioned it when you were explaining that before 2018, before the new regime, the Prosperity Party came to power. Sorry, EPRDF initially, and then now Prosperity Party. But when you spoke about the conferences that you were having amongst the Oromo elites, the political voices of Oromos, and you said, I think it was in DC that you had your last convention in 2016, you mentioned. So I mean, there you kind of mentioned that there was a push to kind of solidify the aspirations for the Oromo people, the future of what they wanted their political environment to look like, all these different ideas of the future of the Oromo political environment. And you said that that was left unfinished, I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
that's what I gathered. So do you think that the fact that that was left unfinished has had a significant impact in the so many different factions that we're seeing that are claiming to be representative of the Oromo people? So we've got the the Federalists here, the people who believe in self-determination up to succession, so many different ideas. And then there's the likes of the current regime, who somehow there's a narrative being pushed that they are also representative of the Oromo people, and that it's just simply the Oromo people's turn now to be in power, right? And then there's another idea coming from the OFC and the Jawars, which is saying the holding on to this power is essential. I mean, in the last publication he released, Jawar, he was very clear in saying a couple of the steps that were taken in order to make sure that the Oromo come to power has been achieved. Now we need to make sure that that power is sustained. So there's a clear indication that he believes that Oromo, to a certain extent, have been able to get the power that they had wanted in the last couple of years. So there's so many different ideologies and aspirations for the Oromo people, right? So is there the fact that the unfinished strategizing of the aspirations, has that led to what we are seeing now, to the so many different factions that we are seeing now?
Well, in a way, you could say that, but I think it is true that that work was unfinished and it was overtaken by the movement and the sudden pronouncement from the Ethiopian regime at the time of about the resignation of the prime minister was a shock to all of us. And immediately the groups that were trying to come together in the Oromo Leadership Convention, the OLC as we called it, started to position themselves to the developments in Ethiopia. And before that was finalized, before even the entire documents such as the Freedom Charter and the Declaration of Aspirations, the Declaration of Principles. There were two major documents of the Oromo Leadership Convention. And before those were actually officially published, the change overtook the process, and the people who were in that group started to think of going home, flying home, just because the then Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn said he would resign in a matter of 2 or 3 months. And so it was literally abandoned in our hands. And from among all the political groups outside, Jawar was the last one to go home, if you remember, because we were, along with myself, other friends such as Professor Iskel and Itana and all other young people who were, most of them who were in universities pursuing their PhDs at the time, including Jawar himself, who was doing his PhD at Columbia. We were the ones who were trying to bring them together, because we weren't political, and we were trying to bring the politicians together so that they can properly give an institutional frame for what was institutional social movement in Ethiopia. For otherwise, it can be hijacked. It can be, suppressed easily. It can be vulnerable to attack, and it, in fact, became just that. And we were obviously overtaken by the developments in the country. And that led to, to the co-optation of many of the political groups into the government. One of the things we realized immediately then was, if we're not as organized as we wanted to be, then there would be a power vacuum. And the power vacuum is not good for our protest movement, is not good for the country, and it's going to be chaos. And instead of allowing a power vacuum to come, let's support a reformist elements within the government, so that they can take up some of the agendas of the protest movement and try to respond to them, and let the changes of, the winds of change that were called for through the protest movement be embraced by the reforming government itself, and let them take it forward. And let's just stand outside and try to help them steer towards making sure that the demands of the protest movement are answered. Now, that was the way we wanted to go about it. And I remember writing a long article in Addis Standard, I suppose, at the time, the hope for transformation from within, a hope or a mirage. That was, we were, is it something that is unachievable, or is it possible? But anyway, I was trying to outline what should happen in the process of bringing in change by using people from within. And of course, EPRDF was given to the reformist thing. It has been talking about renewals, Tahadso, renewal one, deep renewal, and so on. So given that was happening all the time, and when they talked about embracing the demands of the Oromo protest movement and the demands of many for democratization in the country, we said, let's give them a chance. Do we know these people? Who are they? And the one person that was completely unknown at the time was Abiy Ahmed. And the one person that nobody expected to show up at this level was Abiy Ahmed, because there were all the others who we know. And this guy was new. And who brought him along? We see that Lemma kind of trusts him, Lemma Magersa from Opidio, and nobody knew him, really. And that was why, initially, from the very start, the ones that were resistant against Abiy's takeover of the Opidio were Jawar Mohammed and myself. Because he was unfamiliar. From what he says, he seems to be demagogic. He seems to be more in line with the rhetoric of the Dirk than the rhetoric that we are familiar with, the constitutional language that we have, and the constitutional language that the Oromo Kero wanted to be taken seriously. And he was kind of otherworldly. He doesn't resonate with this change that we are trying to promote. And plus, he had this questionable credentials, his PhD, and all other matters. And all those plagiarist speeches we have come to see. And we were basically saying, look, this guy is not just untrustworthy. This guy is not just incompetent. This guy might be a source in a national security threat. If he comes to the forefront, then anyone who knows these problems with his credentials, with his competences, with his plagiarism, with his lies, and so on, can influence him in any way he wants. And we've been on record, kind of campaigning against him taking the power within the OPDO and then within EPRDF. But against our wishes and against all expectations, he managed to grab the power. And so while we were talking about a reform from within, he was basically working on a power grab, a scramble for power from within the EPRDF, meaning there was the TPLF. The EPRDF is a coalition of four major organizations. There is the TPLF, there is the ANDM, the Amhara National Democratic Movement, there is the OPDO, Oromo People's Democratic Organization, and then the Southern Nations Nationalism People's Democratic Movement. So when all those four have been jockeying for power, especially since the death of Prime Minister Meles Zenawi in 2012. There was a tussle about who is going to be at the helm of power. And the tussle between OPDO and ANDM was even visible in 2012 when Haile Mariam Desalegn from the south took power. From that moment on, the tussle between the two was basically destabilizing Haile Mariam, crippling Haile Mariam Desalegn's power. And they weren't listening to him. They were actually having their own politics underneath. And he was literally a lame duck prime minister for all the time he stayed in power. And then the TPLF also trying to maneuver, who has to be in power to promote my interests and so on and so forth. So they receded from the major power position, but they were also working from behind. And so, and throughout, all of them were saying that this is a regime of the TPLF, basically. And sometimes they were acting like who is more loyal to TPLF and so on. So that's why you see most of the leaders today and in the past trying to imitate the TPLF fighters through the scarves and through the outfits that TPLF used to wear traditionally. So they were trying to be more loyal to TPLF so that they can achieve power. That we were not aware of because we are outside of Ethiopia. That tussle, we never thought, if TPLF realizes that it cannot hold on to power anymore, then it means its whole group, the coalition, will not want to hold on to power anymore. If the TPLF wants reform and change, then they, in principle, must want to reform and to change. And that was our assumption. But that assumption ignored the tussle that was going on underneath. There was already a scramble for power within EPRDF, no matter how the country is run, where it is going, how deep the crisis was, it doesn't matter. They just wanted to grab power. And once the machine of scramble for power has been set in motion, it's very hard to stop unless you are within it or you are very observant and know that that's coming. And we weren't that aware. And we weren't aware of this. So we couldn't imagine that there is this power grab at first, because we thought if the regime felt so exhausted that it has to need a renewal, then none of the members of the EPRDF would want otherwise. None of them, the exhaustion of one, we thought, is the exhaustion of all. And when they talk about reform, then it must be all of them. And so we just took them for granted. And the younger faces, the ones that weren't so much in power, like Lemma Magarsa, etc., actually showed themselves up. Lemma, literally, during the resistance to the master plan, he showed himself up. He just started to speak to the people directly, even when he was the speaker of the House of Chafe, the local legislature, the Oromia legislature. He was a lone voice, apart from the entire government at the time. He's saying the master plan is not going to be implemented as long as the Oromo people are not accepting it. And as long as it is not just and fair, there is just and fair compensation for the land, for the people who are evicted from their land, and so on and so forth. He was a lone voice, and we were afraid that he might be actually killed or imprisoned or sacked from government. And as the pressure mounted, as the protests, got momentum, he actually was brought forth into the executive, and he became the president of the regional government. Now that he is the regional government, at least to the extent the Oromia government can address some of the questions, he was willing to embrace all of the demands of the Oromo protest movement. And so we had a spokesperson literally in the president's office. And he was also the chairman of the OPDO. So now that EPRDF talks about change, we thought the chairman of the OPDO, who is going to also be taking over the chairmanship of the EPRDF, they're going to embrace the change. So there is no need for us to go and to organize a newly patched up group of Oromo politicians to position themselves for power. So we let them be. And underneath the Lemma maneuver, there was Abiy emerging, but we underestimated him. And in fact, one of the great advantages that Abiy has until today is that everybody underestimates him. Everybody underestimated him. The TPLF, all of us, everyone underestimated him. And even today, and he deliberately projects this buffoonish attitude. He makes statements that are out of nowhere, and he deliberately does that so that he will continue to be underestimated, but he keeps going forward. Now, because that happened, it made all the different factions from outside amenable to manipulation by Abiy, to co-optation. So some of them were co-opted easily. And some of them were sold the idea that because he is an Oromo, coming from the Oromo party, this is the Oromo regime. And then they started to rebrand the whole movement as an Oromo national movement. And the whole achievement of change as an Oromo change, an Oromo thing. And so, and he had projected at the beginning this image of peacefulness, reconciliation, democratic, civilian, etc., etc. And people had hopes. Everybody has had hopes. And within that hope, though, when he turns to the Oromo, he says, "This is your time. It's your power." So in that way, he co-opts some of them, and they thought maybe, it's probably better to come together and advance our national interest together, including with him, because sounds to be he's in a row, right? Yeah, okay. That was the kind of calculation that many of the political elite groups had. And then soon they realized that the guy has no particular vision, let alone an Oromo political project. He doesn't have any vision except power grabbing. He simply knows what to talk where in order to make sure that power is consolidated under him. So we were protesting against an authoritarian EPRDF. And we actually brought about an autocratic EPRDF that transmogrified itself into a prosperity party regime. So from authoritarianism, we're hoping we'll land in democracy, but from authoritarianism to autocracy is what we happened to achieve. Now, the Oromo political elite, how are they? What is the configuration? There are three major groups, and there have always been three major groups among Oromo political formation. I mean, in Oromo political circles, the Oromo political elite usually advance one of these three major lines of thought. First is the Ethiopianist camp, like the Opidio, meaning that the Oromo has achieved what it wants within Ethiopia. Opidio was formed in 1990s, in 1990, and then when the constitution was adopted in 1995, it was already on record proclaiming that the Oromo national question, all national questions have been addressed, and there is no liberationist talk from now on. Oromo people are free, and so on and so forth. So it was mainly, so what was the next chapter? Peace and development and democracy. Lemat democracy na selam. So anybody else talking about change, self-determination, is a reactionary and an enemy of peace, development, and democracy. So they were othering all others in the name of democracy, development, and peace, and equality of all nations within Ethiopia, and so on and so on. So there is that Ethiopianist element. And of course, this has had long roots even before this bastardized version of Ethiopianist Oromo was created. So there is that. The second group is the autonomist kind of Oromo, who seek self-rule for Oromos within Ethiopia, and also shared rule at the federal level. That's basically federalism, the federalist forces. So you've got the Ethiopianist Oromos, we've got the federalist Oromos, the institutional expression of which is the Oromo Federalist Congress. And Jawar is an outlier, by the way. Don't mistake Jawar for OFC, because he is a kingdom unto his own. He's not he is officially, formally a member of the political party, in fact, one of the leaders, but he has never been speaking or projecting the organizational line so far. In my view, he is part of the Opidio, he is part of the Abiy regime. And I will come back to some of the things that you mentioned, his publication and so on. By the way, that is not his publication. That was a publication from the palace, dictated by Lencholata, transcribed by a person designated by Shimelis Abdissa, and published in the name of Jawar, because Jawar has wider leadership. Okay, I'll come back to that point later. So that was basically Abiy's statement. So that's not an Oromo thing. Prosperity Party is not an Oromo thing. So these are the Ethiopianists. And second group is the federalists, in earnest. If you talk about OFC, you can talk about Merara Gudina, you can talk about Bekele Gerba. These are federalists, okay? This is the organization. And that other guy is a different person unto himself, my friend. And there is the third group, the sovereigntist groups, if you like, the independentist groups, or the people who believe in self-determination of all nations and self-determination up to and including cessation as inscribed in the constitution. Now, so there are these three kinds of Oromo political lines, if you like, political formation. The political parties that were operating from outside during the protest movement were, of course, the ones that were in exile are not the Ethiopianists. The Ethiopianists were at home, in power, partly, within the EPRDF. And the Federalists were persecuted at the time. Both Bekele and Merara were in prison. The leadership, entire leadership was in prison. And the offices were closed, and some of them were, in fact, co-opted, given the name or the seal and so on. But so they were battered. And the OLF was a terrorist organization since 1997, actually. So it was all, they were all operating from exile. The ones at home were crippled by repression. The ones outside of the regime were considered terrorists, so they were actually outlawed and they were operating from outside. Now, now that the change has come, one of the good things that the change brought about is the opening of the country to all political factions that were in exile. And so the sovereigntists, independentists, or self-determinationists, if you like, and the federalists and the unitarists, all of them, the Ethiopianists, all of them went home. And Abiy, looking at the weather, looking at how he can better consolidate his power, he actually warmed up more to the non-Oromo unitarist group, mainly the Amhara elite, and he kind of calmed down the Oromo by giving them this hope that this is their regime. They don't have to worry now. Power is under his control. But these other ones, they are restive. They are insecure. They're so afraid. So we have to calm them. And so we have to appease them. That's how he speaks to the Oromo elite. And that's exactly the thing Jawar talks about until today. Ours is under control. It's okay. But these are the people we have to appease. And you can't appease fascists into democracy. No, you can't. And precisely that's what's happening. They launched a genocidal war on Oromo in 2018 by September, when the OLF was coming home, and they propped and pushed and hustled Abiy Ahmed to start a direct military offensive on Oromia in 2019, including the arrest of Jawar Mohammed. In fact, they wanted him to go on exile. They wanted him to be to abandon, they said he's not an Ethiopian, he has to abandon his American passport, and so on. So they basically started an assault immediately at the moment they came into Ethiopia and became the protege of Abiy Ahmed. And Abiy wanted to use them to consolidate his power, particularly against what he feared was a potential TPLF comeback. So he was pitting them against TPLF. He was using them as a anti-TPLF force. And of course, what that means for them is, along with TPLF, the Tigray people must be completely eradicated, not just pushed away from power realms, but also from the regions and the territories they claim to be theirs, and in the end, actually from the earth. So that attempt to appease them, while also giving a nod of acknowledgement to the Oromo political forces, is telling them that remain assured, I am working for you. That led to co-optation of one of the major political thinkers of the Oromo, such as Len Choleta, and of course, as you can see, also Jawar Mohammed, and many others. But then they knew soon after the change that the Abiy's way is not the way to achieve Oromo political aspirations. So what had to happen was they tried to step away, to step out of his what do you call it? His protectorate. They wanted to protest against him, and the response was violence and imprisonment and repression. And so the federalist groups and the independentists came to have one common ground now. Although they are separate, they are different in terms of their end goal, in terms of their aspirations, the end result of their struggle. One wants a federal union with other Ethiopians in which the Oromo has its autonomy respected, governs its region, and fairly shares power in the federal government. That was all they demand, the federalists. Whereas the independentists want self-determination, meaning whether you want to be in Ethiopia or outside of it. First, that has to be decided. So they push for a referendum. And based on their age-old dream, they also wanted to have, there are especially the forces that want to have their own country, because they believe that Ethiopia cannot be democratized. Ethiopia is still an empire, and an empire has never been democratized. An empire simply cedes the colonies. That's what it does. Cedes force by force. Cedes, if it is a gentle empire that knows that it is losing ground, like the United Kingdom, for example, the imperial United Kingdom, they ceded, they kind of groomed some crop of leadership for all the colonies, and gradually, evolutionarily, they ceded the colonies. They never get democratized. And so there are groups that strongly believe that there is no way Ethiopia can be democratized and we can stay together in a federal union, because they say the currents of political thought that's coming from the Ethio-Amhara elite is basically a supremacist political thought. That supremacist thought, which believes that everywhere in Ethiopia is their country, everyone is their type. If he is an anomaly, she is an anomaly, then he has to be eliminated. That kind of attitude is not one that is amenable to mutual coexistence. So that's not the kind of that's the kind of justice we seek. We need to assert our collective agency, claim, shape our destiny by ourselves, and then if we have to collaborate with others, we can form a commonwealth, we can form a union, a federation or a confederation of some sort, willingly, after we exercised our self-determination rights. So it is a matter of priority between the federalists and the independentists. It's a matter of priority. Otherwise, because the Constitution recognizes both, it recognizes federalism, so self-rule and shared rule, autonomy is a fundamental right under Article 39, sub 3. Every nation has a right to, quote unquote, a full measure of self-governance, a full measure of self-governance. And then Article 39(2) talks about cultural self-determination, meaning the right to language, history, culture. Article 39(1), the right to self-determination, up to and including cessation, which, by the way, also means reunion or uniting with others, such as the GDR was reunited with the federal Germany, and so on. Reunion is also a possibility. So that's part of the interesting thing about the Ethiopian constitutional system, being it's an open federal system. Because the constitution has both the independentist and the autonomist rights within it, the common ground for the federalists and the independentists is the constitutional multinational federal system. And so even when their visions are different, one says it is enough for us if we have our autonomy and have a shared rule in the greater country. The other says, even for that, we need to make a self-determination right first. We need to exercise our self-determination. And then when that happens, during the referendum, you, the federalists, can campaign to stay, and we will campaign to exit, So that's the arrangement. Now, many people get confused between, about the difference between the federalists and the independentists. Naturally, because they all work from the same script, which is the constitution, or towards the same script. If you are in that system, I will not be shocked if if I'm a federalist and the others are independentists. I will not be shocked by any independentist claim, because I know that the constitution allows them. And it doesn't have to be securitized. It's not a cause for anxiety, fear, and seeing them as a threat to national security, dismemberment of Ethiopia, etc., because it is a constitutional thing. As long as there is democratic process for the people to have a say and for everyone to have a say against the separation, as long as that's possible, there is no need for me to fear them or be angry at them. And if I say we need to have autonomy as a federalist and greater share of power at the federal level because of the large number of population that the Oromo people have, etc., that too is a constitutionally legitimate demand. And that should be respected by the others as well. So because of this, they kind of seem to be one and different. People get confused. What do the Oromo want? Which Oromo, they don't exactly know. So they converge on some points and of course differ on others. And so these are the three major lines. And for me, the dividing line is Article 39, the dividing line of all political forces in Ethiopia, not just among Oromo factions, but all other political forces. It's whether you believe in the right of nations to self-determination or not. And in a recent article I haven't still published, I was actually saying a specter is haunting Ethiopia, and that specter is the specter of self-determination. And it's echoing Marx's Communist Manifesto, the opening statement in the Communist Manifesto. Spectre is haunting Europe, and that spectre is the spectre of communism in 1848, he says. But for Ethiopia, I think this is the spectre of self-determination. That's basically the dividing line. And the large majority of political actors in Ethiopia, whether it is Qamant, Agaw, Tigray, Oromo, Sidama, Harari, Somali, we all agree on the principle of and the right to self-determination as enshrined in the Constitution and similar international documents. Now, in the recent publication that Jawar published, because in your question you also mentioned Len Choleta earlier, he basically outlines the different phases of the Oromo struggle. He says the Oromo struggle has passed through 4 major stages, and now we are now at the 5th stage. The first stage was when the Oromo was demanding a respect for a distinct identity, to be an Oromo. And the second stage was to have that national consciousness. And so the second stage was the moment when Oromo wanted a recognition of its culture, its language, and so on and so forth. That has gradually between 1974 and 1991 been achieved. For example, you've got Oromo media outlets. Afan Oromo is a medium of instruction at school and in courts and so on and so forth. And the third stage, he says, was the state formation, which basically means state, because the state demands territory. And there was a territory called Oromia that was recognized since 1994. According to the Constitution. So he says, we have our own state. So the third phase is achieved. The fourth stage, he says, is a call that interrupted it. Are you there, guys?
Yes, we're here.
Right. So the fourth phase was a phase where the Oromo has to control power and control not the Oromo independent power, but the Ethiopian power. That's very weird, because in the Oromo national struggle, in the programs, in the documents, there was no time when the Oromo elite wanted to take power in Ethiopia. They wanted to have their own region and govern it even either at the local level within a federation, or take it away from Ethiopia and govern it as an independent country. And Oromos generally disdain Arat Kilo. Generally, Oromo political elite, the last thing they want to see is an Oromo person waving the Ethiopian flag. It's a shame. When Galasa Dilbo was dead and he was covered with Ethiopian flag and was buried in the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Arakilo, he was like, oh God, that was a cringe moment. Oh no. The guy has spent all of his life fighting against Ethiopia in defense of Oromia. And then you now bury him at his funeral with an Ethiopian flag and rechristening him as an Ethiopian. All Oromos cringe at that, because there's something that is generally wrong, that feels uncomfortable to any Oromo, M, Somali, Sidama, etc. to be living with that flag and with whatever is represented in that flag as Ethiopia. And Oromo's aspiration has never been Arakilo. In fact, I will tell you, why was I being criticized? Why do many Oromos have a hard time accepting me as one of them, Tsegaye Ararssa? Reason is I really engage with the Ethiopian thing. And for them, Mal to Sigalch, Gandanama Mal to Siges. Why are you worried about them? What is that to you? Why talk about Ethiopia? Why talk about constitution? What do you want from them? You know, it takes a courage for any Oromo to take that leap and talk about Ethiopia, because most Oromos think, that's an enemy territory. It was a matter of a joke. If you listen to Oromo comedies, it's like when Abiy talks about Ethiopia, it's like, oh wow, there's a host of jokes about our boy talking about the master's thing. He's doing their thing for them. And here we come, Abiy, Jawar, Lencho talking about Oromo taking power in Ethiopia. That was very strange, very curious thing among Oromos. And part of the reason why Jawar's publication hasn't been spoken about since it was publication in Oromo circles, if you have seen, complete silence. Because what Oromo's national aspiration was to control power in Ethiopia, because for Oromos, it's like that's a bad, rotten house. That rotten house must be fundamentally transformed. There is no point in sitting in that house. That's how Oromos articulate their positions. Generally, even when it is an inarticulate conviction, there is this inarticulate conviction among Oromos, which says, no, that place is not for us. No, thank you. Keep it there. Okay? So that was, I think, a distortion and a mischaracterization of the Oromo national struggles phase. And so he says, the fifth stage now is democratization. We have had our distinct identity recognized, our cultural autonomy recognized, our territory recognized. Now we have controlled power, but this power is not democratized. This guy is an autocrat. So that's where they part with Abiy. And even if he is an autocrat, we shouldn't wrest power away from him, because if we do, then Oromo's national struggle will be frustrated before it goes into its climax, before it achieves its ultimate goal, which is a democratized state. Now, I think that's now beating elsewhere. It has gone out of the Oromo struggles realm. It has gone elsewhere. Now, that's where we differ, and that's why Jawar in the group have a soft spot for Abiy. And so he begins to say, if you see the final part of his article, he talks about the Oromos must change their rhetoric, their narrative, from a liberationist one to a democratizing one. So he says, drop the liberationist narrative and hold on to the democratization narrative, not just because this is what has to be done, but also because the international community can accept only this for you. So take control of Ethiopia and democratize the state, and that's how you have to go. And we say, no, thank you. No.
So a democratized Ethiopian state, just to clarify, not a democratized Oromo state.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I think Ez had some questions.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that, Dr. Ararssa. One thing that we've learned the last 2 years is that that there is no adhering to the Constitution. The central government, like you were saying, is against self-determination. It believes in grabbing power, just like you just described. And Abiy built alliances with people who will help him get there, help him retain his power. And recently what we've seen is an escalation between the federal government and the Amhara irregular militias, whether that be the Fanos or the special forces. And we've seen what the Amhara forces have done in Tigray, what they're doing in Wolega. We've seen the Amhara region leave the constitution and fully administer Western Tigray. They're administering lands in Oromia. But was this not expected? You cannot create these type of irregular forces, arm them to the teeth, and then expect them to sit idle when you decide that the war in the north is no longer sustainable. The same can be said about Eritrea. You can't become allies with a dictator and expect him to abide by your agreements. How do you see the situation play out with the Amhara region, with the ENDF currently taking action in certain parts of Amhara region, and also what do you see happening with Eritrea moving forward after Pretoria? And as we come, Mel will ask you about the talks with OLA and the federal government. But what do you see happening there with the Amhara forces and the Eritreans in the north?
Right. The Amhara forces were the first ones to celebrate Abiy Ahmed in songs, in all sorts of activities, many events, in poetry events. They were supporting Abiy Ahmed because his speeches, his statements were very much resonant with their age-old statements, political claims. And they have always been talking about a unitarist country, one Ethiopia. They have this disdain for multiculturalism, multinationalism. They believe that they are the ones who have the lion's share in the making and creation of the Ethiopian state. They fail to realize that the constitution talks in multi-foundationalist terms, because it starts by saying, we the nations and nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia, we the diverse peoples of Ethiopia create this country. Not you, or not one, not two, not three, but all of us co-equally, we are co-equal founders of this country. And the Amhara hasn't let go of that founderness. They consider themselves the sole founding fathers of that country. In fact, they insist on Menelik, etc., because Menelik and Adwa are the foundational moments for the empire for them. And precisely Menelik and Adwa are actually the day and the moment of conquest and subjugation of the Oromo and the others of Ethiopia. The others meaning the other peoples of the wider south. Of course, Tigray has slightly special character than the others because it was a junior partner in the imperial times, but then it was wrongly ejected from the power since the death of Emperor Johannes. And then from that moment on, it was an onslaught from the center on the cultural integrity and political institutions of Tigray as a people from that moment on. Hence, you have the peasant revolt of 1943 and the Raya revolt even before that, and on, and the first Wayani movement and so on. So they didn't let go of that single unifoundational character of Ethiopia. And they were supposed to let go in 1974, when even the Derg recognized, because it came riding on the back of the student movement, the radical socialist student movement. He recognized, Mengistu Haile Mariam recognized this, but they never let go of the country, and they wanted to keep it as theirs, to keep it as an empire. And so the result is the Amhara anxiety that we see today, and the Amhara elite's anxiety, and it's more like the white anxiety in Western mainstream white societies and in settler colonial countries such as here and in Canada. There is this white man's anxiety. The reason is because these people, the indigenous peoples, are going to, ruin the country, destroy the country, spoil the country and its cultural integrity and so on and so forth. That kind of anxiety you notice among the Amhara elite. And so they say the federal setup that was put in place in 1995 through the constitution and actually 1991 through the charter is divisive and a recipe for dismemberment of Ethiopia, for balkanization of Ethiopia, as they say in their rhetoric, even in the academic circles, for a repeat of Yugoslavia. And somehow they have taken the mantle of Serbia upon themselves and claim the protectionist responsibility that Serbia played when Yugoslavia was breaking apart. And exactly in the same way, Serbia entered into the realm of perpetrating genocide on the other peoples, especially in Bosnia and Kosovo and so on. They actually started to manifest the same genocidal madness in Ethiopia, now in Tigray, in Oromia, and in different other places. And so that Serbian syndrome, that Amhara anxiety, which looks like the white anxiety in general, has come from the idea that they are the unipolar founders of the country. They are their fathers are the founding fathers, and they should not be criticized. They should not be, they should always be celebrated. And Abiy Ahmed went to office, and the first thing he did was renewing the statue of Emperor Menelik and trying to reset up a different statue in his name, refurbish his palace, and so on and so forth. That resonates with them. And so they embraced him, they supported him, and they are unabashed about it. They're unashamed about it. But they never accept him because as an Oromo person, they accepted him to the extent that he was preaching their gospel and pitching to their interests and trying to achieve what they wanted to achieve, which is, number one, renounce identity-based politics, as they say, meaning ethnic federalism, ethnic organizations, etc. So what they are saying is renounce the rights of collective groups, national groups, as collective entities. Do not recognize them as such. Number two, renounce the federal structure, because that is what they call in some learned circles Bantustanization, taking cue from the South African Bantustanization process. That they think is an apartheid system, that they argue is what actually created division among Ethiopians. And Ethiopia is falling short of the glory that it had in the past because of the TPLF brought the federal system, the ethno-national rights that TPLF brought into the public square and gave a constitutional recognition to. So they hoped Abiy will immediately renounce that and abolish the federal system. And thirdly, they wanted a reconfiguration of Ethiopia, meaning we have to renounce the regions. So there is no such thing as Tigray or Oromia or Somali, etc. Instead, we will have only provinces like it used to be during Haile Selassie or to a certain extent during the Derg. That was, and he did a promise, the backdoor promises and, and sometimes public gestures towards that end. His idea of Meddemer, which is also in some circles defined as synergy, etc., that was also an attempt to tell them, to talk about unity without alarming the other peoples. Because when you talk about unity, that language comes from one group and the other nations are like, whoa. So that's not the right word. So Meddemer was basically a code word for the old language of unity. So he makes these gestures. So they celebrated him, they embraced him, they supported him, they propped him up. And when he went to war against Tigray and Oromia, they were the first ones to beat their hearts and say, we are with you. Surprise, surprise, as I always said, you can't fight a people and win. You can't fight a whole population even if their political ideals are ones that you don't like, or probably not even agreeable to many people, if you start to fight with people, you can never defeat them. You can't defeat a people. You can kill them all, but the cause remains sacrosanct. And I said the day Abiy started the war on Tigray, I said now is the beginning of the fall of Abiy, because any regime that started fighting a people, that the day he started that war is the day he has dead. He's died. And I had complete assurance, complete trust that he will at some point be defeated. And that was what kept me speaking up and speaking out in favor of Tigray throughout the dark times when people were so desperate and they were hopeless. I said, there is no way this population can be beaten out into silence and they will be defeated. No way. And of course, finally they prevailed. They pushed back, they resisted. And when they did so, at first, he was contemplating leaving the country. In fact, he bought a villa, a residence in Dubai, and he moved his family and so on. And his cabinet members started to fly away, started to hold on to their passport when the TPLF arrived around Debre Sina, Debre Berhan, etc. And I was working with the OLA and the United Front, trying to prepare a roadmap for the future, and so on and so forth, with, of course, along with the political leadership, the TDF, and so on. And they were basically running away. In fact, at some point, Abiy had to strip the passports of the cabinet members and collect it and put it with himself so that they will not leave the country. And he knew that his power is lost. He knew that he can't beat Tigray, he can't beat the coalition in the United Front. Even with Eritrea, he just couldn't. So they were running around to trying to find escape. And the OPDO, the Oromo Prosperity Party, were basically saying, release Jawar and the prisoners and try to negotiate some kind of settlement with Tigray, and so on and so on. They were panicking because they have a lot at stake at that time. And while that was happening, the international community was watching. And the international community did not want a power vacuum once more, because take Abiy off, the TDF is not interested in taking power in Arakilo. And nobody was so confident that the OLA and the others in the United Front can pacify the country and govern it, especially pacify the Amhara region. And they didn't want to risk create that possibility of power vacuum. So they had to warn sternly, they had to warn TDF and OLA, no, go back. We will make sure that humanitarian access will be available. We will make sure that the siege will be broken. We will make sure we'll force him to negotiate with you and so on, but don't even think about taking over Arakilo. So they had to retreat. When they did now, he has to think again. His power is just saved in the nick of time. So when he began to think again, one of the things he has to accept that Tigray has prevailed. And so some kind of settlement has to be divined with Tigray. When he went to that, they never believed that that would be a reality. They never expected Pretoria would happen. And Pretoria did happen. Then what happens? Walqait will be ceded, according to Pretoria. The constitution will remain intact. In fact, the only political grammar with which to communicate among all political factions in Ethiopia. The federal setup will continue to exist. All right? And identity-based politics will still be there. Worst of all, TPLF will be in power. And they couldn't accept that reality. So what should they do? They should fight him. They should fight him. How? Calling him a man of the, asserting the Oromo power. So they should hit back on him now that he can't, help them achieve their aspirations. He has to be an Oromo now. An Oromo that secretly conspires with TPLF, who tries to dismember Ethiopia, and who is against their interest, waging a war of genocide on us, etc., etc. Wasn't this expected? Yes, it was. But what did we say? There wasn't a strategic alliance. This is not a good thing for the country. This coalition is going to pit the country into the wall, and they are going to face nothing less than war, and war happened. In fact, the bloodiest war of the 21st century happened. And so wasn't he expecting this? He was. He knew that they could be this dangerous. But he needed them to for his war against Tigray. And what he didn't expect is, he didn't expect that Tigray will prevail. He didn't expect that that kind of resistance will come. He didn't expect that Tigray will survive the onslaught from Eritrea and his forces. And to the very end, even in Pretoria, he was still trying to somehow enter Mekelle again, somehow. Even while large parts of Tigray is occupied by TDF, somehow clinch the Mekelle city and then say, I defeated them. But that couldn't happen. That's where the disaffection from their side comes. With Eritrea, he never thought that Tigray will prevail. Again, Tigray is the thing that kind of undoes him. And it creates this divorce between him and the Amhara, divorce between him and the Eritreans. Now, of course, the Eritreans are hard to get rid of once you get divorced from. And he is dealing with that now. He thought with the help of the international community, with the TDF, he might kind of push back the push from Eritrea. But Eritrea, as you know, has penetrated the entire system, the intelligence and security system. The Eritrea has been part of the economic infrastructure in Finfinne, and it's going to be difficult. But the good thing is the Eritreans wanted to do the challenge through various terrorist activities within the cities, assassinations and bombings, and using grenades and so on and so forth in different places, organized criminal groups and these kinds of things. And I think he is alert to it. Abiy is alert to it, and he's trying to do the fire brigade thing. He's trying to control those problems here and there, mainly the resistance in Amhara region. Part of the thing he did was, of course, the constitution wasn't respected when they established the special forces in the first place. I was the first one to argue against the formation of the special forces because it is completely extra-constitutional, unconstitutional actually. And then there was the Fano and the militia who were being armed publicly. And they were valorized through the entire media establishment. And when they went to war in Tigray, they were celebrated by Abiy himself in parliament. They are the heroes of the war. And that was because he wanted to use them, and he thought he would finish off Tigray, or at least make the leadership submit to him by force. And that didn't happen. When that didn't happen, they have what you see now. So the best way to go around it, because Isaias was training most of the special forces, he simply undid, he legally outlawed the special forces now. Because they had about 13 divisions of the special forces in the Amhara region. And they had this deal with Eritrea to raise the number of the divisions into 30, and he was in a frenzy of training many Amhara special forces in Fano. And in an overnight, Abiy said, no Amhara special forces anymore. And so they went to a confrontation. The thing is, throughout the time Abiy's reign, the Ethio-Amhara elite thought that they will support him and they will snatch power away from his hands whenever they want. And again, Abiy is underestimated by everybody. And they also thought they will use him, and when the time comes, they will take over power. And they thought that was easy. They created a number of events, a number of turmoils in the name of the Orthodox Church, in different activities, and they wanted a Sri Lanka-style inundation of the palace and taking over power, and that didn't materialize. So what was left was Eritrea operating through Amhara region and mainly through the special forces. Now that the special forces are outlawed, then the Fano remains. The Fano has to be dealt with, militarily, and it's not a finished work still. They're still armed in many places. They have retreated, perhaps retreated from the towns, but they are in the jungle, and it takes a while until that demilitarization takes place. But I think the Amhara region's social militarization is the handiwork of Abiy Ahmed himself, and I think he deserves them, and they deserve him. As for Eritrea, I think they can. Well, there has to be some things to be done in Ethiopia, but they can only stop him through international cooperation. It's the international community that can have a bite on him, and that's the only way to keep him out of the political equation. And I think the international community is aware of this, and they thought there is a way of removing him from power, and there are different games, there are different formulas that they are working with, and anything is possible from now. But again, there is another unpredictable thing that is happening, which is the Sudan. And so the Sudan thing is going to make them rethink most of the ideas that they were playing with. But Eritrea will continue to be a problem, not just for Ethiopia, for the entire Horn of Africa. And so, yeah, I think I should stop it there.
Thank you for watching Inside Tigray. We will be back next time with more topics and more guests.